Hello, everyone. Your response card. I used to teach kindergarten, so I'm expecting some liveliness here. And I'm going to ask my AV folks, could you nod the webinar camera if we are live? Yay, it's my favorite part of the meeting. Get the camera nods hello to me. Feels like it's a robot. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, on this glorious fall day here in DC. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. There are a number of new faces because this is a three-project co-sponsored meeting. We have the Africa program and the Environmental Change and Security program join us on today's meeting. We're going to dive into China's supply chain challenge from timber to minerals. Just real quick, I think most of you must be usual Wilson Center regulars, but letting everyone know, the Wilson Center was created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to our 28th president. And instead of a statue for pigeons, we created a foreign policy think tank, and there's about 20 projects and programs. And my project, like the others here, we do meetings, publications. I do a lot of exchanges. I had a sludge to energy exchange this summer. I'm heading to China to do some trainings on citizen science and open information, leaving Sunday. But most of my work is focused on energy and water issues. But over the years, in fact, gosh, it must have been like 12 years ago when I had someone from International Rivers Network approached me about Chinese investment in hydropower in the Sudan. And this was when you guys weren't around doing this stuff, WRI, WWF. There were no real big NGOs digging into China's overseas investment. So which made it hard for me to find speakers for the meeting. We had the NGO from the Sudan, and I had difficulty finding speakers. And today, happily, there are more people around DC. Well, you're Rhode Island, but you came down for us here. So, as most of you know, because you're coming to the meeting, that China is the world's factory, and increasingly their supply chains are reaching further and further, encouraged, of course, by the Belt and Road Initiative. And today we're going to look into more the extractive raw material challenge in China. From timber to minerals, copper, cobalt, bauxite, that's your topic today, are all causing lots of both environmental and social challenges. And so today, I've got three speakers, and want to note that, even though Jingjing is at University of Maryland, none of these people are ivory tower academic types. These are people who are actually, they were there. They're out in the field, interviewing people, getting their boots muddy. And so that's what I think is particularly exciting for me, to have them come and kind of give a report back from the field based on their research and their project. And it's not just from academic, because you guys are identifying trends and looking for solutions. And that's kind of a big thing I have here. We're not just about complaining about things. So Lela Stanley is from Global Witness, where she's the policy advisor for their Asia forest teams. And she had a number, and most of her work has been focused on the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, and Lela, you worked in Papua New Guinea for a couple of years and doing community work, right?
No, I've never been based in PNG, but I've been working with communities there for maybe 12 years now.
Okay, yeah, so they're a lot. So she's going to talk about the illegal logging in Solomon Islands and PNG. Then there are two countries that supply 50% of China's tropical log imports. Keeping in mind that it's not just China. There are other international companies that are involved in the logging, but a lot of this wood is processed in China. And then Jim Wormington will pick up the microphone. And he's from Human Rights Watch. He's in the Africa division there, where he covers West Africa. Previously at the American Bar Association, you did a lot of work looking at rule of law and human rights issues in West Africa and Central Africa. And he said to me before, he said, well, I'm not really an environmental or a China expert, but hey, you're here. Because he's going to be talking about the research and interviews that he'd been doing in Guinea, looking at the biggest supplier of bauxite to China's aluminum industry. Because again, but keep in mind, there's aluminum that they process and we consume, right? So this is a global supply chain meeting. I couldn't fit it in the title, but it's that. So Zhang Jingjing, or Jingjing Zhang, depending how you want to flip her name, known you forever. Right? She's an environmental lawyer, first met when you were at the Center for Legal...
Was it
CLAPV, Center for Legal Assistance for Pollution Victims. And now she's at University of Maryland in what's called, the acronym is the T project, which is not drinking, it's the National Environmental Accountability Project, which is inside the environmental law program there at Maryland. And today she's going to tell stories about her work investigating environmental and human rights violations in Africa and Latin America, work that she did in Ecuador to bring a successful court case against a Chinese company. So, there's some big wins happening. And she's also kind of overlapped. Did you guys ever overlap in the field? But they've both been looking into bauxite issues in Guinea. So your job, ladies and gentlemen, is to listen attentively, get coffee or tea when you need it, and be ready to ask some challenging questions. They have fairly quick PowerPoint presentations, and they'll be ready to field your questions. So round of applause to say thank you all for coming. And so now you have to live up to that applause. Lela? Oh, there you go.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Lela. I'm the policy advisor for Global Witness's Asia Forests team based here in the U.S. And as Jennifer said, I'm going to be talking to you about the trade in illegal timber and unsustainable timber between Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands on the one hand, and on China, and then on the kind of ramifications that this trade is having on those producer countries. So just a quick outline. I want to introduce you all to Global Witness in case you haven't heard of us before. Explain, although I think I'm preaching to the choir here, why it is that we've been focusing on China in our timber trade work. Go into a little bit of the domestic and international policies that have made it such a priority for us, and some detail about what this is doing to producer countries, to the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea and the communities who live there. And then provide some recommendations, what we think China can do to really address the issue. So just quickly, Global Witness is an international non-profit organization. We were founded 25 years ago. We're based in London. We have a satellite office here, of which I am part. Our remit is to investigate and campaigning to prevent natural resources and related conflict, particularly associated with environmental and human rights abuses. We also do a lot of work on topics that may not seem immediately related, like anti-money laundering work, have done a lot to do with corrupt oil and gas deals, and quite a bit on the timber trade. For years now, we've been working with China, and particularly the Chamber of Commerce, in developing guidelines for sustainable raw materials sourcing, specifically rubber and responsible mineral sourcing. Those guidelines have gone into effect over the last couple of years. And then we've also been working closely with officials in the State Forestry Administration and the Chinese Academy of Forestry to make the case for why it is that we think that China needs to put measures in place to regulate against the import of illegal timber. And that's really going to be the focus of what I'm talking to you about today. Just quickly, too, I'm talking mainly about Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands here. But we do work on forestry in other countries, particularly Peru right now and Democratic Republic of the Congo, among others. So why focus on China? Everyone here knows. I mean, like with every other commodity, it really dominates the world timber trade. It's the world's largest importer of consumer of timber products. And I'm sorry, I'm noticing now that it looks like some of the words on the presentation are getting cut off. So if you don't see anything, just give a shout and I can clarify. 2/3 of all of the tropical logs on the world market are destined for China. And of that volume, fully 50%, actually a bit more, come from Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And I'll talk about the kind of challenges that poses for China's companies, supply chains, and exporters in a minute. China consumes a lot internally, and then of course it sells to the world. And some of its major markets, the US and UK among them, are sensitive markets. And what I mean by that is that there are countries or jurisdictions that have put in place measures to keep illegal timber out. And I'll explain why that is a problem for China. At the same time, a lot of the products that Chinese companies make with tropical timber are actually consumed in country. They're never exported, and Chinese exporters don't have to worry about the laws of other countries when it comes to those products. So when I talk about outsourcing deforestation, this is what I mean. I think everyone here is probably familiar with President Xi's term of an ecological civilization, and we've seen the development of increasing rhetoric and domestic policy, especially, that's focused on recognizing the importance of a clean and healthy environment, the more sustainable use of natural resources, the importance of mitigating and minimizing pollution in manufacturing and supply chains. But to a large degree, maybe an overwhelming degree, these are focused on China's domestic environment. And we haven't yet really seen the extension of those policies to how China is bringing in and sourcing raw materials abroad. Excuse me. For instance, the green supply chain policies that are in development now don't talk about how or whether raw materials that China is importing should be sourced legally, not to mention sustainably. And while last year, 4 ministries put out a guidance policy document, the guidance on promoting a green belt and road, in countries like Papua New Guinea, which is one of the most recent members of the Belt and Road Initiative, that guidance calls for Chinese companies operating abroad to observe the laws of the company or the countries in which they're operating, but doesn't actually address legality or sustainability issues. So this issue of legal or regulating against the import of illegal timber has really gone mainstream in the last several years. Over the last decade, we've seen countries, including the US, the European Union, Australia, Japan, and very recently South Korea, introduce or amend legislation to keep illegal timber out of their borders. They do this to varying effect. And I think safe to say a lot in the NGOs community would prefer that the enforcement of those laws were stronger, but we are seeing a deterrent effect. Anecdotally, we were doing some research in China a couple of years ago related to a supply chain investigation, and we know that Chinese companies exporting flooring and hardwood products to the US were aware of this very dramatic ruling by the Department of Justice against a US company that involved $13 million in fines and criminal penalties for their import of products made with illegal timber. So these laws are having an effect. And where we see it maybe more practically, it's actually having a deterrent effect on what kinds of products Chinese companies can sell abroad. When in selling to, for instance, the US, if they're exporting anything that may contain illegal timber, that poses a commercial and even a legal risk for those companies. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of products that China produces made with tropical timber stay inside the country. So these other laws aren't as important for those products. We have to think about why else this could matter for China's reputation. I want to show you 2 pictures now. This is primarily intact forest in the Pomio district of Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea shares with Indonesia the 3rd largest remaining rainforest on Earth. It's an extraordinarily biodiverse country, considered a mega biodiverse country that harbors maybe 7% of the world's plants and animals. About 85% of Papua New Guineans are rural subsistence dwellers, so they live in rural areas. They depend directly on their land and forests for sustenance, for cultural traditions, and in particular their forests for providing food and medicine. The area that I'm showing you here is covered by a kind of clearance and agricultural lease that communities who live in this area say was issued illegally to a Malaysian company that is systematically clearing the forest to plant oil palm. All of the timber or virtually all of the timber that's been harvested from this land is sold to China. Since I'd say the turn of the century, China has become overwhelmingly the export market for Papua New Guinea's logs. About north of 85% of PNG's log exports, or somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.7 to 2.9 million cubic meters of logs, are exported to China every year. To a much smaller degree, India is the next important market, but it's dominated by the Chinese demand. And Jennifer alluded to this, but I do want to highlight this because I think it's a bit different from Jingjing's and Jim's presentations in that the dynamic in both PNG and the Solomon Islands, it's not actually Chinese companies who are operating on the ground and breaking the law. And I think that that has provided a certain layer of cover for China in talking about their responsibility to these countries. It's typically Malaysian logging companies that go in. Some of them have possibly familial, sometimes business links back to China, sometimes not, often not, I would say. And increasingly, we are starting to see some exceptions to that, particularly, I think, as Belt and Road investment in PNG starts to ramp up. We found a couple of examples of state-owned enterprises that actually invest directly in logging companies in Papua New Guinea, and some development of major industrial parks that will include forestry. But by and large, it's still overwhelmingly dominated by a non-Chinese industry that then all sells to China. So when we talk about this in China, when we're talking with policymakers, one of the responses we get when we say China has a responsibility to enact some kind of measure to keep illegal timber out, often the response has been, well, actually the onus is on those producer countries to enforce their own laws. It is not China's fault that their laws are not being enforced. In fairness, PNG has really excellent laws on the books that are not being enforced. I want to explain a bit more about the context of those producer countries to explain why that's probably not going to happen and why we focus so much on China as a lever for change. So Papua New Guinea has been an independent country for just over 4 decades, and all of that time, and going back actually some decades before independence, its forestry sector in particular has been plagued by allegations of corruption, by widespread illegalities. PNG is unusual globally in that the indigenous communities that make up almost all of its population have legal control over the land that they live on. It's actually written into the Constitution. So in theory, if you want to log a forest in PNG, you need everyone who lives there to agree on that proposition. In practice, that never happens. And so what we have found and what other organizations have found is widespread law breaking, particularly in regards to violating landowner rights and effectively stealing the timber. We put out a report a couple of years ago that estimated approximately $1 billion worth of timber had been expropriated from Papua New Guinean communities through a single type of lease. So it's a very widespread problem. So not only do people's forests that they rely on get clear cut, they're never seeing any kind of reward or benefit from it. This is my friend Augustine Mondu standing in front of a stack of logs that were stolen from his forest and which will be exported to China. Do I have a couple minutes, Jennifer?
Oh, yeah,
I'm doing okay? Okay.
Need some more hot water?
No, I'm all right, thanks.
Okay.
I just want to go through these.
No, definitely no. It's
Great.
Yeah, unfortunately, next time we'll definitely get the video. She had drone video.
I did have drone video, but those pictures I showed you are from a drone that we brought in, which has been really useful in getting to more remote, areas of PNG. This is one of those remote areas. This is an island off the coast of New Ireland province, so it's about as remote in PNG as you can get, which is already a fairly far-flung place. A great example of the kind of dynamics that people are dealing with there. Essentially overnight, 80% of this island was signed away in leases that the people there didn't know about and didn't agree to. Folks, we idea that anything had happened to their land until ships pulled up to their beach with logging equipment on them and started driving up the island. The leases are indicated in red on this slide. You can see they cover most of the island. The rest of it is already covered by mining concessions. And within, I think, a span of 6 years or so, all of that purple area has been deforested, especially because it's an island. This has been a really devastating situation for these people who have nowhere else to go. And while they technically have a legal resource, in practice, that's not feasible. So they haven't been able to do anything about the millions of dollars worth of timber that's been stolen from them and sent to China. A couple of satellite images to show you what this looks like in practice. This is, I think, in April 2014, before logging began in one site, and about a year later. This isn't even a clearance operation. This is just logging, but it's quite dramatic. And if you see the they're kind of two areas of massive sedimentation. I stayed at a village just to the left, or just next to the leftmost image there. And anecdotally, again, people in the village there told us that they could no longer use that river for fresh water, for cooking and cleaning, and bathing their kids because the erosion and pollution from upstream logging had gotten so bad. So it's not an abstract issue. You know, this is something that a lot of people are dealing with on a daily basis, and to date, it's not something that the Papua New Guinean government has wanted to engage on, and that's why we looked at China.
Do they have coastal aquaculture as well?
Not in the site, but they do no aquaculture per se, but people in those communities in particular rely on reef fish for an important source of protein.
Which is gone now because
Exactly.
they've covered the reef. Yeah.
We haven't done as much with Solomon Islands, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it, but there's a very similar dynamic there as with PNG. Perhaps it's even more neglected. In fact, Google Maps wouldn't even name the country, so I'm indicating where it is with an arrow. Very similar dynamics in terms of widespread illegalities in the forest sector, and maybe even more striking levels of unsustainability in how quickly its forests are getting destroyed. People who like to talk about these things have been talking about for years how quickly the Solomon Islands forests are being leveled. It looks like they are logging about 20 times as fast as they could if they want, or as they should, if that logging were to be sustainable. And what that means is that commercially available forests will be gone in about 15 years. I'll show you in a second what that looks like in practice. But as with PNG, the majority of those logs, of that timber, go directly to China. So we did a nice little bit of, actually we commissioned it, we can't take credit for this, we did this great bit of mapping I'm going to show you that illustrates what this looks like on the ground. We had an organization map out every single logging road in this country. And when you put them all together, the logging roads in the Solomons, which is about the size of Metro Beijing, all of those roads put together are twice as long as the Yangtze. Here's what it looks like. This is one of the islands, or some of the islands of the Solomons. All of those red lines are logging roads. This is incredibly destructive, not just because it indicates how badly the country has already been logged, but when you put a road in, it breaks up the integrity of that forest ecosystem. It's easier to poach, it's easier to pull out other non-timber forest products, so it's incredibly destructive. It looks like at this point over half of the country is within a kilometer of one of these logging roads. Half of the country that's legally loggable, that is. So it's been completely, it's been devastated really, and largely overlooked. And as with PNG, I think the impression that we've gotten is that the onus is on the Solomon Islands to enforce their own laws, but the capacity to do that does not appear to be there. So what to do? Of course, we have recommendations for China. And I think they're quite common sense and actually would bring China into line with the other major economies that already have some kind of mandatory measure aimed at keeping illegal timber out of its markets. Our first point is that we think importers bringing timber to China should carry out thorough due diligence on how that timber's been produced. And when I say thorough, I mean it's not just a question of checking the paperwork. We see in Papua New Guinea that most of the logging operations that exist have all the paperwork they need, but it was often issued illegally or via some kind of fraud. And so just checking a document doesn't actually get you very far. In order for Chinese importers to really ensure that what they're bringing into the country is legal, they may need to go to producer countries like PNG and the Solomons. They may need to actually talk to communities to make sure that the timber wasn't stolen. And then our second recommendation is that as China continues to expand its sort of outward-looking policies, considering the sourcing of raw materials, that it include, specifically in the green supply chain policies, a requirement that those materials were sourced legally at a bare minimum. Thanks.
That's it.
Yep.
Right. Thank you so much. Let's applause here for the. All right, Jim. You ready to tell us your story?
Sure, thank you. I'm just going to check one thing on the slides before I do.
Close your eyes. Don't. Yeah, it does. I told you. It doesn't believe me. Yeah.
So thanks everyone. It's, as I said, it's a great pleasure to be here because, as Jennifer said, I'm not a China expert or an environment expert. I'm an expert in Guinea and West Africa. But it's great to have the chance to kind of share our experience of engaging with Chinese natural resource extraction in Guinea. But before I do that, I want to ask how many people think they could locate Guinea conakry on a map? That's pretty good, actually.
The Woodrow Wilson Center audience, man.
Yeah, so Guinea is a West African country, about 15 million people, often neglected in the news despite having a lot of political upheaval and being extremely rich in a natural resource sense. How many people here have ever drunk a Coca-Cola? Okay, and how many have ever driven a Ford or a Toyota car? Okay, so many more. So Guinea now plays a really outsized role in the global aluminum supply chain. The supply chain that gives you your Coca-Cola cans from Kentucky via Guinea, that gives you the aluminum wheels that you're using for your cars via China, via Guinea. And it really is playing an enormous role for such a small and allegedly inconsequential country in West Africa. Bauxite is the ore that is used to produce aluminum. And it's actually mined in an extremely simple way. I often say to my 4-year-old son, who's massively into diggers, that it is literally like taking sand out of a sandpit. And you can see that it's open pit mining in which you just take off the top layer of soil, often on the top of a hill, and then take off about 10 to 20 feet of bauxite in Guinea, which is then refined into alumina and aluminum, not in West Africa, largely in China and in North America. What's particularly interesting about Guinea's industry at the moment is that it's expanding very quickly, but that it's not expanding with a lot of infrastructure. So you can see here, the only infrastructure in any sense that you see are dirt roads and 2 diggers or bulldozers, which is pretty much how the mining is happening. Similarly, if you look at transport, that's a mining road in Guinea. It's just cutting through forest, dust roads, very little construction, and so easy to expand, but with a quite significant environmental and social impact. And as I say, most of that is going straight abroad, not just to China, but a huge amount to China from ports that are situated on inland rivers in Guinea. So I want to talk about the bauxite sector in Guinea because I think it is such a great example of China's expansion into natural resources in West Africa, the impact that has both economically and in a human rights sense, and the urgent need for groups like Human Rights Watch, for groups like Global Witness, in support of local community groups to be able to effectively be activists in China in the way that we have been so successful in the West and with the IFC and the World Bank for so long. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so great that Jingjing will be following what I say, because that's exactly the topic that she will talk about. China is, as you all know, the main consumer of so many raw materials. That is also true of bauxite and aluminum. China is the biggest producer of aluminum globally, which means that it's also, for the most part, the biggest consumer of bauxite. And Guinea is a pretty natural fit for China, given that it has the world's largest bauxite supplies. So if you look at the flowchart on the right, that gives you an example of how these supply chains are happening. SMB is La Société Minière de Bokeh. Bokeh is a town that's the capital of Guinea's bauxite belt. And bauxite is going straight from Guinea to China Hongkou, which is the world's largest aluminum refiner and producer, and then going into a Chinese wheel manufacturer, CITIC de Castel, that is then being sold to car companies across the West, including in Europe and Asia and North America. So in some senses, in that sense, China's desire for bauxite and Guinea's ability to produce it is a match made in heaven. But before I really get into what's happening in Guinea, I do want to touch briefly on how this all came about, because I think that's also of interest to many people here. So Guinea's role in global bauxite is not a new thing. It's been involved in the global aluminum industry for about 50 years. But China's involvement in Guinea's bauxite sector is pretty recent. It's about 3-4 years old. And the reason that happened is that China got most of its bauxite from Indonesia. About 65% of all bauxite that went to China came from Indonesia in 2013. Then Indonesia, keen to seize more of its national sovereignty, to refine more of its bauxite, to get more added value from the bauxite that it was producing, banned all exports to China. So you went from a 65% supply to virtually zero in the space of a year. So what does China do? China looks, in this case, to a nearby possible supplier, Malaysia. And in the space of a year, bauxite supplied from Malaysia to China went from 150,000 tons per year to 24 million tons in the space of a year. So a very flexible, responsive market, probably because of, for example, how easy it is to do this and how little infrastructure is required. Malaysia then banned bauxite exports to China. And in this case, interestingly, because of its environmental impacts, and I think it would be great to learn more about why that happened, but I think one thing that was interesting and maybe a parallel to Papua New Guinea is that in the Malaysian context, it was a lot of small-scale producers doing small-scale mining, and therefore not much regulation, a lot of unofficial mining, creating a large amount of environmental impact. So again, China's kind of back to square one, looking for another source of bauxite. And at this point, despite being logistically far more challenging because of how far away it is, Guinea becomes quite a logical source. And so by February of 2018, China is getting more than half of all of its bauxite from Guinea. And it's gone, in terms of the amount going from Guinea to China, it's gone from about 1 million tons or a few million at most to about 35 million in 2017, 2018. So again, in the space of a few years, a very quick, rapid expansion. From the outside, and you might have seen the Economist article on Guinea and China from last week, it's kind of easy to tell this story in that simple a way, i.e. China looking for bauxite, rapid expansion, environmental damage. But what's particularly interesting about Guinea is that this has all been driven essentially by one company, one consortium. And that company is called SMB, the company that's on the slide, La Société Minière de Bauquier. And I think that really understanding what's happened in the Ghanaian context means understanding what happened with SMB. So just briefly, just to give you a sense of how this is all happening in Guinea, we'll talk in a fair amount of detail about SMB. So you can see here that the squares that are on the left of the slide are bauxite concessions. So that's essentially the permits that the Ghanaian government has given to SMB. And you can see that anything that is red is a bauxite mine or mining activity. And so since 2015, there's been popping up all over this area these sites of extraction that are then transported down to ports and exported. You'll see on the right of the slide another red active area. That is a mine linked to Rio Tinto and Alcoa. So not only China, other players, but much of the recent expansion driven by China. So talking about SMB, what has been the impact of that rapid expansion? What has been the impact of SMB's role in the bauxite sector? Well, the first thing, and the thing that SMB would say, is that they've demonstrated that they're very good at extracting bauxite. Guinea, and one of the reasons that SMB was able to be involved in the Ghanaian bauxite sector is that for many years, 20, 30 years, they had a whole set of mining projects, iron ore, bauxite, that were frozen. And they were frozen because of the logistical challenges. It's not an easy country to work in. And also because of the politics. It's a very volatile country in which there are strikes every other week, including right now. And it was difficult to get international investors, the Rio Tintos, the Alcoas, to come in and do a large-scale mining investment. SMB, backed by the kinds of Chinese desire for bauxite that we've seen in other sectors, showed that they could do it, and they could do it really, really quickly. And when SMB talks about their business model, that is the first thing that they say. The second thing is that it had a huge social impact. It had a social impact, SMB would say, by creating 10,000 jobs directly, 10,000 indirectly, but it had a visual and visceral social impact in the area where all this was happening. So I was in this area in 2017, about to drive into the Bauquet, which is the town capital, and suddenly we were told we couldn't go in because there was essentially an insurrection. There were thousands and thousands of young people setting up checkpoints every 100 yards, the state could basically not go into the town because it had been taken over by young people. The governor of Conakry, the capital, tried to go to calm people down, and a minister that went with him was so scared he had a heart attack and died. It really was very, very violent. And a fair amount of that was focused against China, and we would be driving around and people would check in our car and say, "Are you Chinese? No. Okay, you can continue driving." But at the same time, there are other mining companies very active, and it was also just a deep frustration with the lack of effective regulation of mining. I'll get to that in a bit. Yeah. And then, of course, underlying that social tension was significant environmental damage. And that was only one of the drivers, but it was a big driver. And I want to just deal with that briefly and just show you some of the impact. Most of the communities where bauxite mining is happening are rural subsistence farming communities that have lived from their land for generations, often through rotational farming. So one field farmed in 1 year and then 6 years of furlough. This is a woman who's on the front of our report that we just released. Check it out on our website on bauxite mining in Guinea. A woman called Maimuna. This was the village that she lived in, very rural, very isolated. And this is it 3 years later with the arrival of the mine. So a fundamental change to the lifestyle of this community, a loss of land without adequate compensation, a dusty road with hundreds of trucks emitting dust and also nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, and just a fundamental change and a threat to the existing way of life. Similarly, this is a woman, Mabinti, from a village just down in the valley, school, clinic, but health clinic, but again, a very rural village. And suddenly you have a dust mining road going straight past it. And what was particularly interesting and why there was so much impact from that was that it wasn't unregulated, but it was essentially very lightly regulated. And this is a company that is now producing 35 million tons of bauxite. So it's not a small amateur project. And the reasons it was unregulated was that the company came in and was so focused on growth, and the government was so focused on growth, that the environmental and social impact assessments, the kind of the foundation of protecting communities from this type of exploitation, just weren't done in a way that could possibly foresee or protect communities from environmental impact. So to give some really easy examples, when you create a massive mining operation, you are supposed to quantitatively assess how much impact you have on air quality. And if you're driving thousands of trucks up and down a road, you have a big impact on air quality. They didn't do that. So they had no way of saying what the impact on the air would be. If you're going to have an impact on the air, you monitor what the impact is. They never did that. For 3 years, they had no monitoring of their impact on air quality. Similarly, if you're going to whack a massive mining road through a rural area, you have to figure out where the rivers are and where the subterranean water is. They never did that. And if you're going to do that, you need to monitor the impact on those rivers afterwards. They never did any monitoring. So for 3 years, you had a massive billion-dollar operation operating with essentially or without the kinds of environmental and social checks and safeguards that you need to protect the people that we were working with. So I think what's particularly interesting in the SMB case, and this is just to give you another quick sense, I mean, this is the mining road seen from space after about 2 years of operation. There's actually a major motorway on this slide that you can't really see, despite it being a major motorway, but you can see the mining road and the amount of dust that was being produced by the mining road. So the question, I guess, is, why was that allowed to occur? And I don't think it's enough to be like China environment bad. Why was this actually allowed to occur? And I think in that sense, it's really interesting to look at this specific project and understand why that's the case. So to answer the gentleman's question, the SMB consortium is a consortium that was made up of, it's registered in Guinea, the SMB company, but it's made up of 3 main players. The first is United Mining Supply, that is basically a Ghanaian logistics company that's owned by a very prominent Lebanese-French businessman who's politically quite close to President Condé, called Fadi Wazni. The second player is China Hongkou, which is the big aluminum producer that I talked about, a large stock exchange listed Chinese company, so not explicitly a state company, that is for the most part owned by a businessman called Jingjing Zhang, who owns about 80% of the stock. And then the last player is a group called Winning International Group that is also privately held and has the majority of the stock in SMB, and that is connected to a Singaporean with links to China called Sun Shushan. Okay, thank you. Who is, as I say, not based in China, but certainly has strong connections to China. So I think it's only in looking at that level of detail in this particular project how you can understand how this all came about and why the government was able to allow this to happen in the way that it did. And the first thing to say about that is to echo what was said about Papua New Guinea, and that is that Guinea is generally an extremely weak regulatory context. So companies of all stripes, Russian, American, Ghanaian, can get away with not whatever they want, but can get away with a lot because it's a very weak regulatory context. So companies will do perhaps as much as their investors require, the IFC, if there are strong IFC standards. But there's not a huge amount of pressure coming from the Ghanaian government, or at least there wasn't in 2015. The other part of that is that, again, we can talk about China, but I think in this case, United Mining Supply, which was the Ghanaian face of this organization, was probably driving a lot of what happened in Guinea. So they were politically quite close to President Condé. Condé wanted growth in a macroeconomic sense. He wanted a win in the mining sector. And this company delivered that by producing a lot of bauxite in a very short time. And to do that, they cut environmental and social corners. At the same time, you also then have, of course, the fact that the investors themselves, the China Hongkaos, the Winnings, don't have, perhaps at this moment, and Jingjing can talk more about that, the kind of institutional norms either in the inside that many Western banks have, or at the outside imposed by Chinese regulators that would require them to ensure that their own project meets higher standards. And it was interesting that we looked at an IFC-based mine in Guinea, an IFC-linked mine in Guinea, and that does have higher standards. So, certainly it's required to meet the IFC's norms, and that does create a level of incentive for that company to comply with. And in this case, that wasn't the case because at the moment, in many of these large Chinese investments, we don't see those kind of internal standards that are needed to hold the company to a higher standard. So I think that's the sort of negative side. But at the same time, it's been interesting to see how much space there has been at our end for engagement with this consortium. And I think, again, easy to tell the negative story, but I think we should also acknowledge what that has been. So very early in our project, and we went to 30 communities affected by bauxite mining in Guinea, hundreds and hundreds of interviews with communities. And very early on, we made pretty clear to this company that we would be issuing a negative report on their environmental and social management. And I had this odd meeting with the head of communications, who was a French woman, who, she was like, why should we bother talking to you because you're going to be negative? And I was like, yeah, we are. I mean, sort of just, you're not doing a great job. But they still chose to engage. And they chose to engage with Human Rights Watch, who, obviously has some issues operating in China. And they chose to do so under the language of human rights and with, pretty overtly with our agenda. And since then, we've had 10, 12 meetings, including with board members from each of these companies, or in one form or another, and a lot of constructive conversation that one wouldn't expect, I think, in this type of context, that has led to some interesting commitments from the company. Again, I always say in Guinea that the biggest driver of company improvement is massive popular demonstrations and riots. But of course, we've been trying to engage in that dynamic as well. And the company has spent millions of dollars doing studies that should theoretically improve their environmental and social management with a view to essentially kind of offsetting the types of criticisms that Human Rights Watch has made. And I think that's interesting because we can ask ourselves why that's the case. And I think it is the fact that this is a sort of hybrid company. It's not a single Chinese state operator that isn't perhaps accountable to public opinion in Guinea. It is a combination of different organizations acting together. And even in the case of Winning, who I think are the biggest drivers of board-level action in the company, it's a Singapore-based company. We've had a private letter from Sang Jishan that you weren't able to really do much more than read, but was a real sign of engagement that we wouldn't have seen before. So I think that that's something positive and something constructive. At the same time, this whole process and this whole project, first of all, overall has had a very negative net human rights impact. This company is still violating communities' rights regularly, and until it demonstrates that it's improving on the ground, the on-paper commitments are only on paper. But also, I think there were certainly some things that we see across multiple Chinese interventions, if I understand it right, and that is there was overall a lack of transparency, a real challenge in accessing data and documentation from the company from the beginning. There was very clear political connections and challenges between the company and high-level Ghanaian actors that made it difficult for particularly local NGOs to engage in this issue. There was the connection to the wider geopolitics of Guinea, in which Guinea is an increasingly close economic partner of China that provides a level of protection to a company like this. And then, as I said earlier, there was this sort of a lack of shared standards and shared understanding of what we were talking about when we talked about human rights and greening supply chains that I think has been a challenge in doing this work. So I want to just end with a few reflections that come out of that, which I think could transition well to Jingjing. I haven't put that on this slide, but I think the first thing is that there's a huge amount of work to be done because there's a huge amount of impact and it's challenging to engage with these types of projects. Just to give you the example of Guinea, China is now building a massive hydropower dam in Guinea that will come online in 2020 and is investing $20 billion more in infrastructure in a bauxite for infrastructure deal. So we're really only at the tip of the iceberg of Chinese involvement in Guinea and Guinean bauxite.
Is that dam to hydropower to help process it in country?
Partly,
okay.
Yeah.
Because it's far away and it's probably easier to ship.
Yep. It's partly that it's primarily domestic consumption, but partly that. But I think at the same time, this work has shown that there is the opportunity in some cases for engagement in the right circumstances, and that we have to connect that engagement to the social consequences of mining, essentially to the rioting and to the demonstrations. We have to understand the nuance and particularity of each of the actors that we're dealing with. We really have to focus in on who are the companies, what is their relevance in China, and what is their relevance in Guinea, and what are the pressure points that we can focus on. We have to absolutely acknowledge the limited domestic regulatory environment. So in Guinea, we should and are doing a lot of work to try to strengthen the Ghanaian government's ability to regulate these companies, which is ultimately what will make the biggest difference. And then more than anything, groups like us and our partners need to develop the ability to engage with Chinese investors and regulators so that external pressure that does come from the IFC and does to some extent come from Western governments actually has an impact in holding these companies to higher standards. And I think I'll leave Jingjing to take it from there.
All right, good. So awesome job, just like Lela. Lela, can you and Jingjing switch seats so she can see the screen? I don't know. I mean, you wear glasses, but you probably need a little bit more. Just while she's switching, what year were you doing? What was the years when you were doing this research and trying to chat with these companies?
Yeah, I mean, so we just published the report on October 4th. Research was 2017, 2018, and we are continuing to engage with the companies moving forward.
Cool. All right, just keep clicking. That's you.
Okay.
All right. And make sure that you speak right to the front of it. So.
Okay. Thank you. And this is it's my fifth time here being a speaker. And and as Jennifer introduced, I'm a China-trained lawyer, has been practicing Chinese environment law since 1999 when I joined China's first environment law clinic, Center for Legal Assistance to Pollution Victims. In 1999, I have been participating China's environment movement in past 2 decades and participate in some major legislative change in China, include public interest environment litigation. And I sued Chinese companies in China, and I was called China's Erin Brokovich. I was a little bit embarrassed right now.
I'm waiting for the movie.
To use that level, but I think if it can help you understand what I have been doing, I will continue. I'm planning continue to doing so, but in a different setting, in transnational settings. That is, I'm looking at Chinese companies' environmental human rights performance outside China, beyond China's borders. And it's just a global understanding that the right to a clean environment is one of the human rights. And so that is, when I talk about Chinese companies' environmental performance, I have to touch upon their human rights impact. So I have to talk both environment and human rights impact. And some people argue, or some NGO, international NGO argue, law is not working in China, the rule of law is weak in China, and is weak in the Chinese investment recipient country too. So the litigation, legal action are not working. But now I don't think so. If it's not working, I will try to make it working, and I'll try to make it work, and that is my role as a litigator. And I would like to apply environmental laws from both sides, from China and from Chinese investment recipient countries, as well as international norms, international treaties. And so that is my what I'm talking is environmental accountability from China to around the world. And I think all of us are talking about the same issue. China's in the environment performance, Chinese companies in environmental performance around the world. But I would like to give you a little bit different perspective and the bigger picture about why Chinese companies are actively operating all over the world. That is Belt Road Initiative. And then I will talk about the 3 cases what I'm working on, include the case in Guinea. And then the last one is the avenue of accountability with my recommendation. And Jim already mentioned some of my recommendations.
You stole it.
And basically this is, so I assume some of you have already known the Belt Road Initiative. Some of you may not. So I give this picture of the Belt Road Initiative, and this is a drive behind many Chinese economic activities outside of China. Belt Road Initiative and its early version, this Going Out policy, which announced around 2000. And going out of policy basically is economic policy. It was encourage Chinese company to chase the profit outside China and bring the natural resource back to China. And while the Belt Road Initiative has much bigger goal, has much more geopolitical implications than going out policy. It was talked by Xi Jinping when he paid a trip to Central Asia in 2013, and it was officially announced by the Chinese government in 2015. And now, right now, by far, you can see it's there are more than 100 countries and international organizations have signed agreement or signed a memo with Chinese government to indicate they won't be the part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it has already gone beyond the geographic definition. It's not just along the ancient Silk Road and ancient Maritime Road. It's beyond that region. And the latest country joined the Belt Road. Guess which country? Someone can, who know that country?
Iceland?
Venezuela.
Venezuela.
And the latest one joined from Africa, joined the Belt Road is Senegal. And it's beyond that, the map, and you couldn't see it, but they have joined. So it's not only about the Silk Road, it's China's, and specifically Xi Jinping's ambition, Xi Jinping's China dream. So I have to talk about some Chinese slogans on Belt Road Initiative, because if you read Chinese media, you have to understand what those China keywords mean, and they're all about Xi Jinping's ambitious plan. And so you see this, I want to read this sentence which was showed on the Global Times, which is government media, and the Huanqiu Shibao, and during the Africa-China summit in September. So it's very recent, and so it says, with enormous goodwill and friendly cooperation with Beijing, Africa can join the ride on the Belt and Road Express and bring its wisdom of the community resilience on board and integrate it with Chinese dreams of rejuvenation, and jointly construct a community with shared future for mankind. China and Africa, along with a vast number of the countries in the global south, are in strategic and vantage position to engineer an inclusive international order of the human community of the shared destiny. So that long sentence, you find some keywords that all in this Chinese dreams, 中国梦, and share the future of mankind, 人类命运共同体. Those words have been repeated by Xi Jinping many times, include Nina mentioned the ecological civilization. Who knows what that means? The China and the Chinese dreams. But that is Xi Jinping's dream, and you can see what he wants to do and what the world is responding to his dream. And those are challenges facing China as the Chinese government, the states of the UN. And while China is claiming that the Belt Road Initiative is to build a shared future for all humankind, and many countries criticize its neo-colonial power, and it has been setting up on many death traps in Africa and Asia, while China has been proud of its non-interference foreign policy. International human rights NGOs are requesting China to bear its extraterritorial obligation to protect the human rights beyond its border. They are asking China as a state member of the UN Human Rights Council to regulate its business entities for their human rights performance beyond its border. So there are many challenges China is facing, and I'm looking at from the micro level, not the country, the government level. So I have been looking at individual investment projects all around the world. And in the past 2 years, I have been traveling to 16 countries, include 8 in Africa, 3 in Latin America. And so I will talk about one of the 3 or 4 of my cases I'm working on. And the first from the West Africa, from another country, Sierra Leone. And when I was there, I was standing along that river, and the river reminded me 10 years ago, I visited investigating another river that was in China. So the same kind of, and the reason is the same open pit iron mine. So the same kinds of pollution, and the same pollution in the river, heavy metal. You can imagine you will see the iron, copper, and all this heavy metal, cadmium That's the case. The case in Guangdong province. It's quite a well-known case because along that river there are 12 villages, small villages, and all the village in all those villagers have much higher rate of the cancer, and it was a cancer called. We give the name those village called cancer villages, and I was there, and I was interviewed by the CNN and chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. And so that was 10 years ago. That is a similar case, mining case I was working on. I was representing one of this village, tried to file litigation. The case was rejected by the local court, so we couldn't make that case. It is a state-owned enterprise there. So that case made me think about how can we help the local village in Sierra Leone to face the same the problem, same challenge as the Chinese village already suffered. And so I was there. And attend this village meeting with my local NGO partners in Sierra Leone, and that is the village. You can see the name of this company. And now this company is facing the two set of lawsuits. One set is in Freetown, the 3 class action lawsuits and on the people's health and economic laws. And another case is in London. It's a criminal case. And many of you will be confused why this company has been sued in London, because it has been dragged by its partner, which is a UK-based company called African Mineral. And African Mineral has been sued in London because the killings and the injuries before the Shandong joined that project. And obviously, this company hasn't done enough due diligence on the human rights violations. It signed a deal with African Mineral, and African Mineral was sued for its killings before Shandong company, Shandong, was joined. But Shandong was dragged into that criminal case in UK, in London. So that is a challenge the Chinese company are facing if you do not do enough on the human rights due diligence. You may be sued. And then this is the second case I'm working on. This is Jim has talking about it's not a lawsuit yet, but but you can, from the Jim's talk, you can tell the issues significant, very significant there. I was there visiting with the local NGO representative, Mamadi, and which is, we all worked with the Jim, and both of us are working with him and the other local NGO on the ground. And so you see that it was May, it's the early raining season, so the dust, you cannot see the dust, but if you're out there, you still can see. The reason I want to show this picture, the women have to go very far to fetch the clean water. They used to have the well in their village, and they can easily got the water. But now, because the mining roads cut the river and water resource, and they lost the water in their village, so they have to go very far. And the women suffer more than men and that is a gender perspective. The first time I have been saying women has been suffered much more than men. And you see here in this village meeting, the senior village, there's no any woman in the meeting. I was there talking with all the senior the village leaders. They are talking, they're complaining with the SMB, the Chinese mining consortium, but there's no representative from women. And the issue there is definitely, Jim has mentioned Chinese company. I can see it does. I got into the mining base because I'm Chinese, and I talked with these three managers there, and they let me in and let me bring my NGO partner into their building. I do respect their work because it's a very remote, very tough environment for Chinese to work there. But obviously they do not have a good understanding, no matter the Chinese laws, Chinese policies on the outbound investment, nor the local regulations. And I talk with them if they know the mining legislation in Guinea, and they said, yes, we do. We have a version of the laws on our hand. I asked them, send to me, and then when I received it, I was so surprised. They said, we have a Chinese version of the Guinea mining legislation. So I asked them to send to me. Then when I received it, I figured out it's not a Guinean law. It's a French mining legislation. So they didn't know. They definitely they didn't pay much attention on the regulation and laws, and that is one of my findings along my trip is. Chinese companies, the level of the rule of law and in the country, the stronger institution, the better Chinese company will perform environment friendly and pay attention to human rights. The weaker the institution are, and the Chinese company will take advantage of that, the weakness, and go around the law, or simply they didn't know the law, they didn't know the requirement from both sides, from China or from local government. And there's also another finding from this trip or from other trips is Chinese companies are reluctant to respond to community requests nor interact with civil society organization. They often assume the communities are greedy and they are troublemakers, and they called in China Diaoming, and because we provide job opportunity, we bring economic to your region, and you come here, request, we give you, build the clinic and build the hospital and give you some money. They consider it, community are very greedy, and this is what I heard this term from one of these Chinese managers in the company. They said they are very Tanan means greedy.
Wow.
Yeah, and that is one of my finding. And Chinese companies are often seeking help from local government. In local government in Guinea, in Sierra Leone, in other countries, like they did in back home. If they have an investment, any project in and province in China, they seeking help from local government or officials rather than engaging with a community or NGO. This is what they get used to in back home in China, and when they operating outside China, they have been brought their mindset, their business usual to other country. So that is I have been finding along my trip, almost every developing country, the site, the investment, the Chinese-owned investment site. When I talk with local community, I talk with NGO. This is a general impression for the Chinese companies, and. But there is a good sign. The law is still working, but the issue is how can you use the law strategically, use the laws from both sides, from China and from Chinese investment recipient countries. And there is a good case, a winning case, and I participated in this lawsuit in Cuenca, Ecuador, and the case has been successfully suspended mining operation in Cuenca, Ecuador. This is a China-owned gold mine in Cuenca. And I was there present my amicus brief to support indigenous people's claim. and the indigenous group successfully won the case. And there's two legal arguments in that case. Is first, if the indigenous people have the constitutional right of consultation. And the second is, if it's the mining, the site should be suspended because it's in the buffer zone of the national park, and the judge supports indigenous people's claim based on this. That's the understanding of the first. The indigenous people do have the right of consultation, and it is the mining site is located in the protection zone of the national park, so it should not be operating there. So that is reason the judge gave the winning judgment in favor of the indigenous people. And while I was there, I present first China endorsed the UN Declaration of Indigenous People's Rights, and so in general, Chinese government support any effort to protect indigenous people's rights, even though China claim there is no indigenous people inside China. But if if it's happening in Ecuador, I suppose Chinese government should support indigenous claim to protect their right of consultation, their right to their sovereignty, their right of the nature. So that is one of the arguments, my point in my amicus brief. And second, I express in Chinese environmental protection law, the people have a right to participate in decision-making process. And it is the same norm have been reflected in the Ecuadorian constitutional law. Ecuadorian constitutional law gave the indigenous people rights to know and the right to participate in the decision-making process. So that is the same norm in both countries' laws. So I emphasize if the Chinese company, this Chinese company is familiar with, has been complying with Chinese law in Chinese environment law, and it's supposed to understand that norm. And if it understands Ecuadorian law, it should comply with Ecuadorian law. So based on the two set of norms and two set of the laws and the same norm, the company should consult with local indigenous people. So that is the main point in my amicus brief. I present that amicus brief in Chinese, in English, and in Spanish. That is one of the difficulty to working the country which have a different language, and the language barrier is there for NGO to working, and it takes a lot of effort for me understand the Ecuadorian laws and or translate Chinese law to Spanish, and so it takes a lot of work. And here is one I want to give a bigger picture about China's regulatory system on outbound investment. There is no coherent laws, but some regulation, and the regulation were made by government agencies, but not by the People's Congress, which means it's quite low-ranking regulation we call measures. And when we use this term, measures that indicate, in Chinese is 部门规章, in our legislation law, it's no-ranking regulation, and among them, they are all conflicting to some certain degree, conflicting with each other because they are made by the different government agency. Some are made by the MOFCOM, the Ministry of the Commerce, and some are made by NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission. And then there's another main player, we call the International Cooperation and the Development Agency, which is a counterpart of the USAID or GIZ or JICA. But I haven't seen any regulation have been made by that new agency yet. There are very many policies. The policy made by government agency, by the business association, and some company made policies. And obviously, we talk a lot about the guidance on greening Belt and Road Initiative, and which is issued by the central government agency for the government agency together. But the issue is the policies are non-binding, and there's no any legal consequences there. So we have been seeing there are some political will from the Chinese government to make the outbound investment or international trade green and clean. But to what degree government want to enforce those policy, namely to make those policy to legislation with legal consequences and make them binding, that can show Chinese government has a political will to really make the Belt and Road Initiative green and make that initiative a shared humankind the 共同体. It's hard to, even for me, hard to use that slogan. So, and talking about another avenue is international regulatory regime. There are some international environment treaties and like the Convention on the Biodiversity. It emphasized the indigenous people's lifestyle should be paid attention to. And there are set of the international human rights treaties which China has been signed and ratified. There are two set of the norms, UN Declaration on the Indigenous People's Rights and UN Guiding Principle on the Business and Human Rights. They are not treating. They are not treaties. They are not binding, but they are set of the norms which encourage the UN members to comply with. And there is an ongoing process to draft these binding treaties to regulate multinational, transnational environment and human rights performance. It's ongoing, and it's on UN Human Rights Council. But I assume China won't be easy to agree to sign it. And there's another avenue is the International Financial Institute, like Jim mentioned, IFC, or at least IFC has the World Bank, IFC all have their own, its own internal grievance mechanism, but it's very slow. And but in China, we didn't see it. We couldn't find it. I heard AIIB, Asian infrastructure industry bank, which led by China, is about to. It's talking about set up the internal grievance mechanism, but I assume we won't see it happen very quick. So that avenue is not existing by far to any Chinese financed project. I think the important thing is the host country, the Chinese recipient country. They need improved. The bar in those countries need to be raised, because that is the first avenue. The local court, local laws, local institution should be strong and to be resistant to any the Chinese investment which may harm the local people's livelihood and local ecosystem. And that bar should be raised. And so that, say the case in Guinea, the law enforcement, there are some laws on page, but the enforcement are always weak. So we need to have the better enforcement of laws. And we need to have independent judiciary. It's better, easy to see, harder to do, but we have to push to that direction. and we need to have an active and knowledgeable NGO, civil society organization like us. We all work together, build effective collaboration to handle this new player on the Chinese companies for their activity beyond China's board. And it's new challenging, and it's new, unlike the old players from Western countries, those Western country-based multinational. There's much more transparent than Chinese company, even though they are not transparent at all, but they're still relatively transparent. So we need to build this alliance among Chinese NGOs, international NGO, and local NGO. That is, I think, the driving force to make Chinese company accountable for their environment, human rights violation on the ground. So
And of
that's
course, we need you wandering single-handedly to how many countries to talk. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask one question of the group, and then get ready to ask your own questions, okay? But I mean, all of you had suggestions at the end, and it's a gigantic laundry list. Where do we start? But I mean, one commonality is that you all three, I mean, you're going to the companies, because the countries themselves, I mean, the law is there, but not being enforced. I mean, is that your approach? I mean, you're focused primarily on the companies, and then what's your next step? Human Rights Watch, Global Witness. Well, we know Jingjing's doing everything, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think
It's a broad question, but
no,
take
it's
it
a
where
great
you
question.
can.
I think in reality we're going to the companies and the governments, and so in the case of SMB, the government primarily is the government of Guinea, and we are definitely engaging with the government of Guinea across the bauxite mining sector. I think as Jingjing said, the reality is that their enforcement capacity is low. They're very focused on investment and on attracting investment. There's also obviously corruption across all sectors in Guinea, without talking about a particular case. And so I think it's probably easier to have concrete change at a company level, but of course you won't get the long-term change unless you're engaging with the governments too.
What about environmental impact assessments? I mean, at the end of this month, I've got a group from China, from the Ministry of Ecological Environment. They're coming to talk. I'm putting together, bringing a bunch of people to talk to them, in a small group about because they're not looking, they want to reform their environmental impact assessment system in China and take it not just to look at projects, but look at programs more broadly. But I mean, that's because those kind of assessments can at least be kind of a baseline. I mean, is that you guys?
Yeah, I mean, so in this case, I think environmental impact assessments were sort of the heart of the problem, in the sense that they were done by SMB and then approved by the Ghanaian government with a view to getting this project as quickly off the ground as possible, and therefore they were like pre-assessments or pre-assessments and not actual assessments. And so you definitely, those should be the foundation of a decent environmental and social and human rights management plan. But I think on that point, I mean, similar to Jingjing, it's not a question of could this company have done that? Does the Ghanaian government know how to approve ESIAs? Absolutely. They made a choice influenced by multiple factors to basically not do a good one.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's a political or behind closed doors issue and not a capacity issue. And that I think is, everyone always talks about like training Ghanaian environmental inspectors. Okay, that's really important, but ultimately it's a political will and an enforcement issue.
Okay. Anything to say about what's your next step?
Yeah, definitely. I'm suing. I've been suing a Chinese company, and
She's going to sue everybody. Watch out, world.
But I still want to address the obligation on the government and
Which government? The Chinese? Both.
I
Both.
think both need to be aware the complaint from the local community. And when I mentioned this, China always have this proud of our non-interference policy. says, so what happened in Guinea is not my business. We are not interfering in the business in Guinea, but it is China's business right now because it's Chinese investment, and all the bauxite has been shipped to China and for China's economy. And then you see there's some. I just see this example. When you can never imagine this, the battle against the air pollution will affect the people living in Bokeh, the village in Bokeh, because the battle against air pollution in Beijing, so there is a prioritized task from the central government to provincial government in China to curb the air pollution. So central government announced this order to cut the output of the aluminum refinery in Jingjing Zhang and surrounding Beijing and Tianjin and Hebei, Shandong province, Shanxi province, to cut 30% of the output of the refinery each winter. And Hongqiao Group is based in Shandong province, and it lost the profit because that order requires from the central government to cut the output of the produce of refinery. So Hongqiao Group decided to build a refinery in Bokeh on the side next to the mine, and that is a new move. And the people living in Bokeh, the village, will be affected by that move, that decision. And that decision from Hongqiao Group is because the central government, Chinese government's order to curb the air pollution in Beijing. So
War on pollution,
yeah.
domino effect overseas now.
So you can see we are all connected. This is a globalized world, and what happening in Beijing, and people, they get a cleaner air, but the people in villages in Bokeh, they will be suffering more because the refinery project will be built in 2 years.
Lela, anything you want to say about the engaging the companies?
Yeah,
or
so
next steps?
maybe not engaging companies as much, but calling for China to require its companies to take action. And I think that reflects a couple of things. One, we see that as one of the most efficient kind of ways of addressing this trade. Looking just, for instance, at where the timber from Papua New Guinea is going in a single year in China, I think we worked out that about 20 Chinese importers were buying about 80% of the timber. So that proportion, that rule held true in that case. And it means that that's a quite efficient way to tackle the problem, as opposed to, for instance, asking China to try to regulate the flow of illegal timber throughout supply chains, which get extremely complicated and messy as you kind of move through manufacturing steps. But it also reflects our growing understanding that Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands and a lot of the other countries where China is importing tropical timber from struggle with the rule of law, struggle with high levels of at least perceived corruption. And I can really only speak to Papua New Guinea, but we don't see the political will there to ever make the steps necessary to crack down on illegal logging. This has been a problem, a really profound problem for decades. And the change is not happening within the country. We're still lobbying the government there to a degree, and we're supporting local civil society groups in their advocacy efforts. But we really feel that China, because of its outsized role on the global stage, is the tool, is the lever, is really the only thing that will make places like Papua New Guinea change their behavior.
I mean, that's one thing that's striking to me is that you said 13 companies, basically one company, that the potential for, China to be the lever for positive change here, it's doable.
Can I just say something briefly on that?
Briefly, and then we'll start taking questions. And
just really briefly, when I gave a sort of similar presentation in Guinea, there was a journalist who, the first question he said was, "You're paid by Trump to attack China, right?" So there's multiple reasons why that would never happen. But I think it's really important, in this forum that, for example, in Guinea, the issues that we're talking about really cut across companies from multiple locations, including the US, particularly Russia and China as well. So I think, in Guinea, as we're doing this advocacy, we have to be very careful that it is couched in a sector-wide versus China-wide piece of advocacy. And I think that that's just something important to say in this setting.
Good. All right, so we're going to take some questions, and if you can just say your name and affiliation briefly. Try to keep questions and comments brief, because I think there's a lot of comments out here. All right, here you go, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ni Akwete. I wear many hats, but I'm an immigrant from Ghana. I've worked on foreign policy in the U.S., in Washington for over 40 years. The biggest hat I have here today is that I'm a friend of Jingjing's. She invited
Jingjing,
me.
part of her mafia. All right, good.
Thank you very much. I think this is such a interesting and needed discussion. I'm hoping I'll be able to communicate with you later.
Yeah.
So my question is to Jim. I am from Ghana as opposed to Guinea. But the U.S. actually built an aluminum smelter in Ghana in 1960. I just learned that the new Ghana government is now signing an agreement with China about bauxite. So it sort of sandwiches Guinea's experience. And so I think your work is great. Here is my quick comment and question. You talked about the government in Guinea and some of the things they need to do. My comment is about civil society and voters, because my work is all about from the grassroots up. I can assure you, you even mentioned that when there are protests, then the government listens. And I think the electoral route is the thing to focus on. Communities, when they understand the power they have about voting and putting pressure on the government and maybe even changing the government, then the next government will understand about the environmental concern. So I guess the question is, do you think that is something to focus on, grassroots and NGOs and people's electoral vote to protect their environment? Thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
Sure. I mean, thank you for the question. And just briefly, I think Ghana is a fascinating case study for all the reasons that you said. And, I think Guinea is kind of Ghana 20 years ago. Is that right? Yeah. Anyway, Ghana's bauxite industry is emerging and will at some point, somewhat resemble Guinea. And there's some really great groups in Ghana that are looking, for example, at the impact on rainforest of open pit mining. And I think it's really an urgent issue that could learn a lot from Guinea. So I think it's great that you talked about that. I think I'll maybe tell an anecdote that gets at that question. I think Human Rights Watch often in the past, and including now, has been focused on kind of naming and shaming, investigate, expose, change, and then engagement with these high-level actors, the companies, the government. And I think that can do a lot, for sure, but it doesn't change the underlying dynamic, which is of disempowered communities and very empowered and powerful companies. So I think that absolutely what you're talking about is 100% needed. And I think that one of the unfortunate things is that in some sense it's quite easy for companies to engage with, me. My colleague who was with me in Guinea described us as the acceptable face of activism. Because, we're not like angry communities who are angry about the fact that our water has been cut off. And so, unfortunately, I think there are some real barriers to communities getting involved directly with companies because they're seen as more hostile and, less perhaps easy to manage. And so I think that is ultimately the long-term solution. And, we have to do everything we can to make sure our work is integrated into that.
All right, the woman right down there. One thing I want to add, there's a Chinese NGO called Global Environmental Institute, which Jingjing, I'm sure you've crossed paths with them many times. I mean, they have kind of their overseas BRI work is to be a kind of watchdog and try to fill the data gaps. Like there's one guy who's going around Africa looking at how China is building a lot of ports. So they're looking at the impacts of the port and the kind of the infrastructure and the impact of the infrastructure to actually build and run these ports. And I thought, wow. And so, but gathering that information and giving reports to the Chinese government because they feel that their value added as a Chinese NGO is not to, go and build the capacity of NGOs in these host countries, but just to kind of shine light. Have you interacted with them at some point?
No,
I think I need to introduce you.
That would be
I need to
fantastic.
introduce you. All right, ma'am.
Yes, hi, I'm Emira Woods, an independent consultant, but on the board of Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. Thank you all for your courageous and amazing work. I have actually two questions. First, the BRICS Bank, under its new name, the New Development Bank.
New development.
Yeah. Are there any of these impact assessments, any of those criteria that you're describing as part of that new entity? I'm also concerned about, I think the NGOs on the continent are rising up about debt and about the debt that's then owed to China. And it's becoming, I think, an organizing medium. So I don't know how that is fitting in with all of your work. I'd love to hear your analysis on that. But then my other question was on media and Chinese control of media in Africa. Because all of you are pointing to the importance of people's power rising up, and what we see is increasing dominance and control of China in the media scene. So just wanted to hear your thoughts on that as a challenge as well. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, I can talk about the International Institute in China, basically the two, AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Industry Bank, and the New Development Bank, previously called BRICS Bank, and one based in Beijing and one in Shanghai. And to my knowledge, AIIB did publish the environment and the social impact safeguard, but it hasn't done any substantial work, and it hasn't set up the internal mechanism to receive complaints from the community affected by the non-supported project. So it's an ongoing process, and I think there are a group of NGO targeting AIIB. I didn't know much about New Development Bank. I assume it should be there should be the similar guidance, the social and environment and social safeguard there. And China is not leading that bank, and because she's I think the five membership there. And I didn't know much about that institute, but AIIB is always the target for NGOs to try to promote the environment friendly development financing. So. But we need to push it more. In terms of other financial institutes in China, Chinese banks, commercial banks, and as well as development policy banks, we call the China Development Bank and the China Import and Export Bank. None of them have the internal mechanism to receive the complaints, but there is a good ongoing case right now. The bank, there is a small bank, has been sued by NGO as well. Sued two defendants, the company who damaged the environment. The bank gave the loan to the company. Both of them have been sued by NGO in China, and the NGO requests joint liability from the bank to compensate to the people who suffered pollution.
Either of you have any other comments to add for that? I'm not as, I actually just know down topic for a future meeting, Chinese control of Africa media. Because I don't know if we have some knowledge in the room that can answer that question? Because you guys don't know that one either, do you know?
No, I can't speak to Chinese control at all, but we actually see kind of an analogous situation in Papua New Guinea where the companies that are doing the logging are all Malaysian, and one of the largest logging companies also owns, among many other things, including an airline, one of the largest national newspapers, and they will not run anything critical of logging. So it's certainly a dynamic there as well.
And just on the debt, briefly, I mean, I think specifically in the bauxite sector, and this is true of Ghana, I think, as well as Guinea, basically, the deal that China has struck with Guinea last year is that they will guarantee 20 billion in infrastructure loans to come in about 20 years in several tranches. And in exchange for that, China will have access to Ghanaian bauxite. and that the royalties from that bauxite, the sort of taxes from that bauxite, will pay off the 20 billion. So it's sort of, I think people are in the financial world, as I understand it, happier with that type of debt because you have a concrete good that you're using to pay back China over time. But basically, it ties Guinea into China's involvement in the bauxite sector for 20 years. And so if there are environmental and social consequences of that, Guinea has less leverage in addressing them.
I want to add, infrastructure for the natural resource deal is very common and have been seen in Africa. The China's the engagement in Africa often use that model, but I try to find the deal between Guinea government and the Chinese government on the bauxite mining, as well as the Ghana and Guinea. Both agreements are not public available. So you see the information is not available for the public. Even for me, I searched, I dig very deep, I couldn't find it. It's that
Or
is
sometimes it's another country's law. I like that one. Question, I want to toss it to Lela, but the other two to relate. When we think of timber, I mean, you gave a list at the very beginning of your presentation, the Lacey Act and other regulations that basically are bringing the supply chain to us, right? I mean, it's the U.S., but also, so kind of at the very end state of the green supply chain. And in the timber area, it's been, you cited that there can be some success because it's highlighting the risk. Or not that well?
Yeah, no, I think it's starting to, the Lacey Act here in the U.S. and the European Union timber regulation are relatively young, have not been vigorously enforced yet, but there have been some success cases like the lumber liquidators case I mentioned earlier that resulted in a $13 million fine. Interestingly, when we were doing our investigations in China, so we were looking into a very complicated supply chain that started in those forests of Papua New Guinea that I showed you photos of, went through several layers of manufacturing in China, where the timber was mixed with wood coming from legal concessions, coming from Solomon Islands. No one could keep track of where anything was coming from or whether it was legal or not, and was then being exported, including to the U.S. And so companies in the U.S. who were buying these products had no way of knowing whether it was legal or not, and that's a huge risk for them. And what we heard anecdotally from Chinese companies doing the exporting was that because of that case, larger companies had to be aware of the law and obey the letter and spirit of the law, whereas smaller companies were able to still fly underneath the radar. So it's having a deterrent effect. And there actually have been studies on how much of an effect it's having. Of course, we want to see more, and we would like to see China kind of come into line.
I mean, that works for timber, but I'm looking at aluminum. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, I think
that's a tougher
it's
supply chain.
I mean, we just did a big campaign on gold and diamonds called Behind the Bling that was
Behind the bling, okay.
really effective on largely on child labor, but also on other parts of the supply chain. And we are seeing now efforts. For example, I know that the International Copper Institute, or whatever the equivalent is looking at sort of guidelines for responsible supply chains in the copper industry. And there are similar. There is the Aluminum Stewardship Institute or initiative. So I need to engage more with those. It is potentially slowly happening, but I think to have a really compelling consumer case, you've got to both kind of demonstrate clearly the supply chain connection, like the diamond ring,
blood diamond. Yeah, but it's
the T-shirt from Bangladesh. And I think we need to be more effective in doing that, and we haven't done that.
Yeah, it's a tough sell. Okay, some other questions. Do you want to get it? I can race down too. Either way. And then when you're done, you pass it down to people to your left. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Judy Shapiro from American University. All three of you are talking about legal issues, compliance issues, and what I can't somehow wrap my mind around ultimately is that even if all of this extraction and manufacturing were done legally, I doubt that the planet could handle it. And so the conversation was starting to move towards the consumption side of it, but there's something wrong with the model. So even if you're doing everything by the letter of the law, it's still going to be too much. And I don't know, that's just my comment. You don't even have to respond to it, but yeah.
Well, but I mean, with that, Judy kind of links in the recycling question. You know, China's not taking the plastic recycling. You know, so that it's another market. And I think though, what's intriguing to me, and I'm going to have a meeting on this for sure, about how by China not taking, you know, importing less, basically cutting off most of the imports of plastics and other recycling, you have this jolt to the entire global supply chain of waste reuse. And you know, there's questions about, well, maybe we can now create our own markets because, you know, it's no longer, China's not there, but it's a big question. Sorry, you just threw out a question. Do you have any comments? You're just like, Judy, you just said something that we can't handle.
The only thing I would say is, again, like that sort of fits in the criticisms that I get from Ghanaian, you know, people who are seeking to undermine us, is to sort of say, well, the West has done this method of exploitation 150 years ago, and that's what you founded your supremacy on. And so what right do you have to tell us not to? And I think if it doesn't fit within a kind of bigger vision of a sustainable world, it is harder to articulate. But we're certainly not engaging in that because we stick to kind of the human rights framework for an individual project. But I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz, I'm retired. And Jim mentioned the idea of naming and shaming companies, and Jingjing has been suing companies. But ultimately, all these decisions and actions are being taken by individuals. And I'm wondering if anybody's tried actually naming, shaming, and suing individuals instead of the companies.
Lawyer.
You're talking about suing the
Specific manager
the
or owner?
consumer.
No, the owner, more like the owners of the company.
Owner of the companies. No, not yet. But I know it could be very powerful if the owner or CEO of the company could be prosecuted because the damage, the human rights violation, that could be very powerful, but unfortunately, at least from the Chinese law perspective, I couldn't do it. Maybe if we have lawyers from U.S. Or European system, maybe we can discuss possibility. But yeah.
Well, you speak in the microphone because. Well, then don't give it up yet.
Okay. Yeah. For example, in Guinea or one of the other countries, could they sue the local foreman or the local company managers for doing the damage? Because they're the ones who are actually doing the damage.
But ultimately, I think it's the company, though, that has the contract. But your question made me think of something. So Jingjing in China right now, I mean, with the war on pollution, and it's, you know, it's not just a slogan that we have these new laws and regulations, air, water, soils coming down the pike, but that one interesting component of it is that local officials are being made accountable. That it's in their job evaluations more, and you know, and then you're getting this enforcement. Like there was, you know, of course they didn't do this on the East Coast, but where was it in Gansu, where the provincial officials lost their jobs because they were actually allowing smelting and other polluting things happening in a nature reserve. Now, if some of these are Chinese companies, I mean, can this kind of, you know, I don't know the reach of the war on pollution, but in some ways, a Chinese-owned company is linked often to a local official. I mean, can there be punishments? Do you envision a way of that could be another interesting avenue, that a local official who's, you know, he's responsible for the air quality in his province, but then his province's company is going to Africa. Any mechanism that we can make that work?
Yeah, I don't know. It will be difficult, and so far we have to solve the first issue is China has jurisdiction over the dam happened in other country. That's still the challenge we haven't overcome yet. Like the tort case, if some village got canceled and because the pollution from the Chinese owned the mining site, if we can sue help this victim file litigation in China or not. So if the Chinese court can accept the case or not, that challenge we haven't solved yet. And talking about make the government official, Chinese government official, to be accountable for their approval to Chinese project in Guinea, Ghana. I don't think I don't think it will happen very soon.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's tough, but at the same time, it's just kind of it's an intriguing thought to me. Yeah. Some other questions. The back here, right here. Thanks, Jingjing.
Hi, I'm Naomi Basak Trainer. I represent Forest Trends, which is an international environmental NGO, and we work to transform markets away from products sourced illegally from forests, including timber, rubber, other extractives. May I ask 2 questions?
Please do.
I work very closely with Lela and Global Witness. We've been working within China for many years, trying to get them to pass some sort of mandatory legislation for due diligence in timber imports. They have promulgated a number of these voluntary standards and guidelines for investing in the forest sector, in minerals and others. So, question for Jim. You mentioned that Hongqiao Group is listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. I know that they have some sort of environmental and social guidelines for listed companies, and then there is the CCCMC guidelines on sourcing minerals. Did these ever come up at all in conversation? Were companies aware of these, and did it matter? My guess is it did not.
I asked you the question.
Yeah.
So I can answer your second question.
Okay.
I asked the local 3 Chinese manager there. I asked if you are aware this CCCMC made guidance. CCCMC is one of the mining association, one of the 3 big mining associations there, and they say no. And I conducted research. The issue is CCCMC hasn't made the guidance or guidelines and the industry standard yet. It's a long way to go because CCCMC is only one of the mining association in China, and there are another 2 bigger one. And each of them affiliated to different government agency. There is the China Mining Association, and Zhongkuanglian. It's much bigger. This is a big brother. And there is a China Association for the Non-Ferrous Industry, which is Hongqiao, which Hongqiao is belong to. So Hongqiao is not a member. I couldn't find any information if Hongqiao is a member of the CCCMC, but Hongqiao is a member of the China China Association for the Non-Ferrous Industry. So that 2 mining associations, they haven't issued, and I didn't see any their endorsement on the CCCMC guidelines. So I say that the 2 guidelines made by CCCMC have long way to go to be industry standard in China for the Chinese outbound investment.
That's good to know, not to mention enforcement.
Jim?
No, I mean, Jingjing is far more expert than me on that. I mean, I think the only thing I would say is that one of the particularities of this project is that SMB sees themselves to a large extent as a Ghanaian company with Hongqiao as an investor. And so if challenged, they almost always say Ghanaian law is their primary reference. Negotiations are with their Ghanaian or French or, Chinese people, but based in Guinea versus with the Hongqiao group. Although, of course, that's an avenue for advocacy potentially later down the line.
It's interesting. My second question is for Jingjing. So we've been working with the State Forestry Administration for many years, and it's quite frustrating because this is not a forestry issue. The SFA has a domestic remit. It's an international issue. And so you say there's some political will for regulatory change. Where is that coming from, particularly in this sort of newly reconfigured structure of Chinese ministries that's happened this year? And what avenues would you suggest for an international NGO to engage in the policymaking process, if any?
First, from all these the guidance or guidelines issued by the Chinese agencies, you see, at least you see there are some political wills there. But
Not from mandatory regulations that
yeah,
actually
that is
enforce
the question I raised. To what degree Chinese government want to make those guidance policy to be enforceable and to with legal consequences that show how strong the Chinese the political will from the Chinese government. That I didn't see it. I see there's a good documents on the page, but the government hasn't done much to enforce. Policy are not supposed to be enforced. They are voluntarily voluntarily apply compliant by the players, and they're not enforced. Should not be enforced, and only laws are designed to be enforced. So that the change from the policy to legislation that can show Chinese government has strong political will, and but so far I didn't see. I didn't see yet, but the new agency I would like to recommend you in both on the work on the. Right now, the forestry administration changed to the name to the national. What's the national forestry and the grass? Yeah. And so it's new. Same agency with new name and new functions, and also pay some attention to this new international cooperation and development agency, and it's. On the mandate, on its mandate, it's supposed to regulate China's foreign aid and outbound, all the investment development project. So that should be the new avenue, new agency. It's new, so maybe they provide some space for the international NGO to work in.
You know how big that new agency is? I know it's like so. I'm gonna ask around when I go to bid. Yeah. I think we may have to, unless is there another burning question, but you can gently tackle them after the meeting because we're coming. We start on time, we want to end on time, and give you a few moments to chat with them. But first, can we applaud my stellar speakers one more time? And their PowerPoints are online in a PDF. I also want to thank the China Environment Forum. We keep the lights on from Luce, Climate Works, and Energy Foundation, and also. John Meza here today, and Daniel Neighbor, who's my Schwarzman fellow, who's been tweeting like crazy, evidently, over there. But yeah, I want to note, too, that what's interesting, we're having a meeting in December with Barbara Finnemore from Natural Resource Defense Council and a couple other speakers to talk about, the meeting will go up in a couple days. It's called "Can China Save the Planet?" Because Barbara Finnemore wrote a book, but she's focusing on, and I was thinking of it the whole time here, because she's focusing on China, how they're turning the coal Titanic in China, becoming more energy efficient, renewable energy, and really becoming the climate leader. But the whole time in this meeting, I'm like, bauxite, they're moving it overseas, where maybe, do you think that, they're doing hydropower, building coal plants most likely, so that the energy footprint of the Belt and Road Initiative, just so you know, Boston College and WRI just issued a report today on the climate footprint of Belt and Road Initiative. So they'll come and talk at my forum too at some point. So December 6th, if you want to hear kind of a slightly different take, and I'm definitely going to ask Barbara some hard questions from things I learned here today. But thank you so much for coming. If you're not on my mailing list and want to get on it, come talk to Jar or me. Again, one more time. Yay, thank you so much. Really good job, people.